Good evening, everybody. Good to see everyone after town meeting last night. Good to see you again tonight. Welcome to Tri-Board meeting. It's been the first Tri-Board meeting that we've had in a long time, probably 7 or 8 years. Many people here at the table are new, and part of the reason for meeting tonight, as was mentioned at the second Finance Committee budget hearing, was to talk about our long-range model. We haven't worked collectively or had a discussion collectively on that. That would be helpful to level set, noticing there are some that were in their respective roles back in 2021, others not. And thought it would be helpful to take a step back and talk about some history as to where we were, what the model is, what it was designed to accomplish, how it's done so far, and where we are presently. And then I'll turn it over to Kevin momentarily, but just to go through and have an opportunity to ask questions, and I'm sure that if you have a question, others will, but it's a chance for all three boards together as well to have a conversation about our planning. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you. I'm gonna head here. Good evening, everyone. So we really want to make sure this evening that all three boards have the opportunity to engage in the same conversation and talk from a common understanding of the overall financial model that we've been working on and through since prior to the spring of 2021, and the override that was put in place for fiscal year 22. So as a short recap, the initial override, conversations really started in October and November of 2020 and continued into that spring when there was a community-supported override, a vote of $9.5 million. So this evening, we just want to recount the parameters of the agreements that were put in place and also talk about the underpinnings of the financial model, the actual numbers that we have now, how they compared to what we thought we would see in 2021, basically how wrong I was, how wrong we were. We've raised a lot more revenue over the last 4 years than we thought we would, which has put us in a really good spot. So I want to start there. So just as a quick preview. So when I look at the revenues, March 16th, 2021 is a date that the select board and the school committee met in open session and really formalized and finalized the agreement between those two bodies. And the numbers that we looked at that night were to serve as the basis each year that we go back and look and compare to how we're doing and what as compared to where we thought we would be. On an annualized basis, we're raising about $8.7 million more in fiscal year 25 than we thought we would have been in 2021. That's done a couple things. We haven't touched the override stabilization fund, and the original 2025 forecast projected us using almost $2.8 million in override stabilization. So we haven't used any to date. We've actually built a balance of over $9 million. So if you look at override stabilization, we haven't used any. We thought we'd have used over $3 million. And then on recurring revenue side, the biggest difference so far is really local receipts. And they're performing at almost $6 million, or we're budgeting them about $6 million greater than we thought we would be able to. So that's where the growth has been. And local receipts were somewhat sandbagged in 2021, of course, by COVID-19 and just complete uncertainty in the financial markets, which has cleared itself up perfectly, and things are much easier now. But I'm really happy where we are. Obviously, we're really happy that we outperformed the model. But let's just go back and recount what that was. So what we did in building the actual numbers, and I'll get to the narrative, but when we looked at the actual numbers, we have a really good set of data that we relied upon. So myself and Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Collins and spent a lot of time looking at the data. So what I have on the screen here is the traditional line items that we use in the budget: municipal education, shared operating support, and debt service. And we looked at what was occurring from 2023 to 2020, the fiscal year that we were in. And we saw a lot of variation over that 17, 18-year time period. We saw average municipal budgets increasing about 3.25%, average educational budgets increasing 4.5%, operating support even greater than that. But there's great swings, as you can see there in the bottom right-hand corner. So, during that same period of time, there was a year when the municipal budget increased by over 14%, and the school budget increased by over 9%. But we also dealt with the realities of reducing budgets in year over year in some instances, and that was as low as, or a reduction as much as 8.85% for municipal. So obviously a good historic set of data is important, but we have to deal with realities. We kind of shaved that down in our next iteration, and when we shaved it down to a shorter time period, just the 10 years, some trends really started to become clear to us. The average annual increase for the municipal budget was 3.75%, and education was 4.13%. And we started to narrow somewhat of the volatility, but it still existed, at least the good side of the volatility of the up years. We advanced it and narrowed it down, and again, we saw those averages becoming much more clear. And this is where we really ended. So we didn't discount the full 18-year period that we looked at, but we focused on the most recent 5-year period, excluded the prior override that happened, and we settled on baseline trends and needs of roughly 3.5% for the municipal budget and 4.25% for the education budget. So these numbers that we talk about kind of secondhand at this time were developed through a lot of analysis, 20 years of data, and then we just kept refining that to bring it more current and really figure out what we could do to reduce the swings that we saw in the far right two columns. So when we graphed that out, this is what it looked like, and this is what we continue to refer to as the EKG chart that's so difficult for us to manage and deal with, and there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of time wasted. Joe and I talked this afternoon, and he had more experience in wasting time with his leadership team trying to figure out 17 different scenarios that may come out of the town manager's office with what budget we may have. And Joe and Chris can talk about this part a lot better than I can, but this was the change in state aid, right? So this is somewhat smooth and predictable, although not perfect, but this is when Chapter 70 formula changed and we became a minimum aid community, and we saw declining recurring investment from Chapter 70 and experienced this significant period of volatility that really continued through the 2021-2022 budget cycle. And just to underscore, this is no way to budget. This is no way to ensure that we have high quality education. This is no way to ensure that we can operate the library with certainty. This is no way to ensure that we have adequate public safety resources. It goes across the board. Obviously, there's some similar trends between municipal and education budget, but in other years there was, municipal losers and, education winners and vice versa. So what we attempted to do is stabilize the budget while filling the gap that we had with opening the field school, which was certainly the tipping point that brought us to having a serious conversation about the override. But we saw the opportunity to eliminate the EKG and provide stability and certainty over a longer period of time. And we've achieved that. And this isn't a made-up chart. This grabs the information from the prior chart and continues it from fiscal year 22 through fiscal year 25. And that is a result of us using expenditure side limitations, not benefiting from a development in 1 year, grabbing that revenue, applying it to the budget, and hoping next year we have the ability to maintain a cost of living adjustment or general inflation. We set expenditure side limitations and bring budgets with greater certainty, a lot less drama in the January, early parts of January, because we know where we are. And the expenditure side caps have really no ties to the revenue that we have. The revenue that we have, we've been very diligent in putting it into the override stabilization account, which means that we'll continue to benefit from a stable environment even as our annual recurring revenues begin to not be able to sustain the operating budget on an annual basis. I would say if we didn't do an expenditure side limitation and we spent all the revenues, these numbers would probably be both much higher, but we would have already had to ask for another override because most towns fall into the trap of expending the revenues that they have, building them into the base budget and trying to keep up with the following year. I forget the number, but there's been so many override questions that have been asked in the last few years. Certainly that's being pressured by inflation, but we've been able to not even have to deal with inflation from a macro level on our budget. It's impacted what we've been able to fund in the budget, but it hasn't strained us, putting us into a deficit in comparison to the revenues that we've raised versus the expenditures that we've been able to fund. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Stone. He's going to talk a little bit deeper about the assumptions that went into the model, and then I'll be back up to kind of tie this all together into that core agreement that was entered into by the select board and the school committee.
So we'll walk through the revenue and expenditure assumptions that were used in the development and the forecasting of the out-year plan. And these are our assumptions that we do review and update when better data is available. For tax levy, we maintained the 2.5%. New growth by averaging both the 3, 5, and 10 year. We are starting at 1.3 million in FY26 and we're declining it to 1 million. I don't think 7 years ago, Kevin and I thought that there would be new growth in this amount at all, so it's sort of outstanding to see. But I hope it continues. State aid, based off of the percentages we typically see from the original budget that's provided through the cherry sheets, we are averaging about 1.01% year over year. Local receipts, it's about 250,000 year over year, but we have started to ratchet up the amount that we are initially budgeting in local receipts the past couple budget cycles to sort of more mirror what's been coming in to the town. General stabilization, we're not projected to use any in the out year expenditures. The override stabilization in all the models, withdrawals will be expected to begin in FY27. Free cash, we're holding level at 3 million. This is for the capital budget and the standard warrant articles. Operating budget reserve, not projected in use for the out years. And then CPA funds, we didn't add those as revenues coming in or project expenditures. They can come in and go out, but it wouldn't ultimately impact the forecasting here. On the expenditure side, general stabilization, we are maintaining at about 300,000 per year. That is to keep our policy level. Override stabilization, when we can fund, we fund as needed. Operating budget reserve fund, the attempt is to make sure we maintain this at policy level each year. This is the Finance Committee's reserve fund. Municipal expenses, we're going to look at two models, 3.5% increase year over year and a 4% increase year over year. and with education, 4.25 and 4.75. Shared operating support, you may have seen in some of the previous slides, this 6.65 number has become very consistent in how we've been budgeting. We've been holding that level moving out. We're lucky to be able to use actuals for debt and interest. And utility enterprises, based off of the adopted financial plans, we feel comfortable with about 3.05% increase. And then we have the other departmental and capital items listed there as well. We use historic average warrant articles, charges and offsets from the state aid. In capital projects, we're trying to keep around 2.1 million in free cash a year. So this is a forecast with FY25 and our current budget. FY26 would be the projected budget we'll all get to see in May, and then going forward through FY30. The top row is the revenue that is anticipated to be coming in, the expenses below that. And then we have the stabilization balance at the end of the year, and then below that is the use or deposit of funds into the stabilization balance. So we can see that in FY27 will be the first year under these percentage models where stabilization will be drawn upon, 2.5 million coming out to support the FY27 budget. And the FY28 budget is fully funded, but as we move into FY29, at this point in time, there is insufficient funds to meet the requests and needs. In the bottom, we have a breakout of the expenses. As we've typically seen in the master balance sheet, education, municipal, shared operating, and debt service. And these are all running on those models, the 4 and 4.75 and 6.65. Now, this is the other model. It would be ratcheted down, 3.5 for municipal and 4.25 for education year over year. A quick reference is that instead of using 2.5 in 27, and the mouse is gone, we're using 1.9 million from the stabilization. Obviously, we're still funded through FY28, and the deficit in FY29 is 4.1 million in this model, where in the other model it was 8.2. So by reducing about 0.5% municipal side and 0.5% on the educational side, the cliff in the out years reduces by about 4 million in FY29. Again, the expenditures below match the percentages described. So here I just took the revenue from each model and laid them up above each other so we can get a sense. In both models, we're getting 7 years out of the initial override, which again is a testament to the strong financial position the town has been able to find itself in, and the management with the expenditure caps. And then we go to this one here, and this is the model expenditure comparisons. Very similar, but instead of revenues, it's expenditure comparison. So if we're trying to get a sense of what the budgets look like in FY30, we're looking at either 190 million versus 187 million, depending on the model selected. Leave up, start sliding.
So why, right? Why do we have to do this? I think everyone knows, but Proposition 2.5, which was put in place in 1980, limited municipalities from being able to have a tax levy increase, that is the amount of money that's raised year over year through taxation on real property, by no more than 2.5%. We talk about it all the time. There's one addition to that, which is new growth. So as someone puts an addition on their home or builds a brand new building, whether it's commercial or residential, 100% of those new taxes are brought in. When we look at those numbers, we're on an average year, we're somewhere around 3.25% of total revenue that we receive year over year. Proposition 2.5 wasn't a hard and fast cap that was placed on municipalities that said your budgets need to not increase greater than 2.5%. It was merely a check on some budgets within the Commonwealth that were somewhat out of control and increasing at very high percentages year over year that were unsustainable. So the legislature put the cap in place and then gave communities the ability to go to the broadest aspect of the community, all registered voters, and ask to be able to raise more money than the general provisions of the laws allow them to. So Proposition 2.5, in some ways was a judgment, but in other ways was not the end-all be-all to what municipalities are supposed to be able to spend in the average year. It just requires municipalities to do additional things when revenues are needed above and beyond that. I think our history that we've shown in the model that, and the analysis that we did in developing the model shows that 3.25% on average is not going to sustain the level of services, whether that's quality education or municipal, that we expect and the residents of Shrewsbury expect. So we've taken this model, we've borrowed it from Arlington, who's had several more overrides asked within this model, and we applied some unique parameters to Shrewsbury, and I think we've been very successful in our first go-round. That model isn't without guidelines or considerations. It's built upon the premise of municipal budgets increasing 3.5% and the school budget increasing 4.25%. And then requires an analysis of the projected revenues for the current year in comparison to what we originally projected in March of 2021. And then when we're able to set additional money aside into the general stabilization account and the override stabilization account, only then can we increase municipal and school budgets to up to those higher thresholds. So the first 2 years we expended both budgets at the highest threshold. In fiscal year 25, schools net was about 4.3 and municipal was at 4%. And we're working on the same parameters. Fiscal projection one for the town was a little less than 3.5%, but we've made some adjustments that we'll be bringing to the finance committee on Thursday, but will be less than 4%. So I think we have a good plan in place. It wasn't perfect. We never envisioned it to be. It's performed a lot better. The economic conditions in town have been a lot better. There's opportunities for improvement. The calculation almost doesn't make sense on an annual basis anymore because the revenues are so vastly different than we ever considered. As I said, somewhere around $7.5 million a year, $8 million a year. There's no way to reasonably project that in 2021. So we have opportunities that we can consider in the future on how we tweak this model. And again, I think the most important thing for us to do this evening is to ask questions, talk this through, what the existing model is, what it means, and get back together as we look at a future model.
Any questions or comments? Vikram?
So thank you, Kevin and David. This is great, great way to put it together, and so it makes a lot of sense. I had a couple of questions on the revenue. So the tax levy, does that in any way differentiate between commercial and residential revenue, and does that have a different impact going forward? Is it just one big number, or how would that relate to the model? Because if we increase commercial revenue, would the model change?
No, it really wouldn't. So when you split the tax rate, you can still only raise the same amount of taxes. So if you shift, you're shifting the burden, right? So the total tax levy is an exact number. You know, it's 2.5% greater. When you shift the tax rate, you don't get a different number in the end. It's just, it comes from more from commercial and less from residential. It doesn't help us raise more money year over year.
But does the 2.5 proposition also apply to that?
It does.
Okay.
It does. So as a residential taxpayer, you may pay less,
Mhm.
and the commercial taxpayers would pay more, but the levy is still the same number.
And in your 3.25 number that you came up with, as far as, does that include local receipts as well? When you said 2.5, we increase every year, but generally because of new construction, it goes up to 3.25.
It does. I mean, they've been trending well ahead of that recently, you know, in the double digits year over year. For a number of reasons. Cost of motor vehicles and demand for motor vehicles, growth within the community, bringing more vehicles in, and investment income. Because, you know, we're very conservative in how we can invest, but, you know, that's been very favorable over the last few years, where we're pulling in 3% and 4%, where previous years we were pulling in 0.25%, so. But that's an all-in revenue number, because you have to remember, you know, state aid from unrestricted general government aid and Chapter 70 has really only been 1% a year. And that's our second largest revenue source, so that kind of reduces the impact of the additional growth that we see in local receipts, which is a smaller packet of money.
Kevin? Just curious about expectations for population growth and demographics and how they're worked into all of this, because that's ultimately the driver of operating expenses at the end of the day. I'm just curious, even from a chart standpoint, when you're showing the change in expenses over the years, I would be curious to see population growth during those timeframes, if there is some consistency there, just for perspective.
That's an analysis that we really haven't done, to be honest with you, because we instituted that kind of the hard expenditure caps at percentages. We know that population growth isn't, you know, beyond it's not 2 or 3% a year. It's probably 6 to 8% over a 10-year period. But we haven't really looked at that to see if there is a point of enlightenment or anything there. I mean, we do look at that in the perspective of new growth and the amount of growth that we'll receive. You know, you have to remember roughly $1.2 million in new tax levy is $100 million of new assessed value within the community, which, you know, that's a lot. That's a lot of development that's happening, and that's what we've been seeing year over year for the last, you know, 3 to 5 years.
Other questions, Bond?
So I'll add to Brian's question, right? Have we done a correlation with the inflation?
On our revenues and inflation, I haven't, but it's something that we could dig into.
Any other questions? Lindsay?
Yeah, Kevin, can you talk about one of the important pieces also is that we have shared expenses between municipal and education, and that also was a part of the agreement. And I'm just curious to see that had a 6.15. I'm just curious to know how that has pension obligations and healthcare and other such things for all employees. And I'm sure some other things that I'm forgetting about, but how has that trended into actual, right? Is that close to what we're spending? Obviously, many of us feel healthcare is an area of
We've
growth.
spent at least that much. So the maximum trend on that is 6.65%, and we've spent at least that. I believe the FY25 budget is a little over 7%.
Okay.
As you know, it's heavily driven by health insurance. Health insurance makes up about $17 million of that $20 million line item. So it has definitely been challenging to stay within that cap.
When we talk about the cuts in state aid, how drastic were they? I mean, what percentage did it go from to? Because I think that has a big issue in the budgets as well.
So you're talking about like the 07?
Overall, we went from whatever percentage or whatever dollar figure was to a much lower level that the town was now responsible for versus the state. And there was no override for that per se at the time. So,
Joe, I don't know if you.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a number Chris can be looking
So from an
to.
unrestricted government aid standpoint, it would took from '08 to '21 around to get back to the previous level, so 13 years on that number.
Right.
When,
But was that number $1,000 a year or $1 million a year? Because that's a big difference.
3.1 for unrestricted government.
Million.
Yeah.
So that's basically $100 million worth of development a year that we would have had to have coming in to make up for what the state took away from us.
Isn't that much of a drop?
It's just, yeah, well, it'll be 3 times that. Because for every $1 million in taxation, it's 100 or so million assessed value. But if you're saying in 1 million.
I'm just trying to figure out, because that was a big drop for the community.
Yeah, right.
And we're all complaining that our taxes went up, which they did, but there was reasons for it. The state decided they weren't gonna fund us as much, and we could be at that mercy again. So I'm just trying to figure out what that number was. It should be pretty easy to come up with.
So my recollection, and then I'll turn over to Joe, is that Dale and I looked at this back in 2017 in terms of Great Recession, Chapter 70, state held us harmless based on the calculated formula, and then we went to minimum state aid. So if you looked at our numbers back in 2017 for Chapter 70, we were probably about $19 million, and then we went to minimum state aid after that. But that was by design from the state to push us over to what, based on our wealth, that we should be funding. So when we were a high growth district in the 90s, if you look at the total amount of Chapter 70, $19 million, it was more than Southfield, Northborough, Westborough, Hopkins, all of those communities, and that was where we were able to get a lot of that funding. That stopped, but that was by design, the Commonwealth to push it over to funding locally for education.
I agree, but that's my point, is I don't know that the community has really continues to hear that, right? We didn't have a choice. They cut the funding and said, you know what, you guys are wealthy, you should raise your taxes. Basically what they said. And as we try to do that, we get pushback. So my just point is, I think we need to get out to the community more about, this is the reason why our taxes have gone up. This is why we've had to have an override. We had an override because the state decided we no longer deserve the money we were getting because we had too much money in the town. And I just want to know what kind of that number is.
So just to be clear, that change happened in 2007 to 2008. So
Yeah.
it didn't drive the most recent override.
Well, I disagree. It happened in 2007-8, so we've been losing that money every year since 2007 and 8. Whatever, we're getting 4 million, and now we're getting $1 million. That's $3 million deficit every year we have, unless my math is wrong.
So this chart explains the percentage of state aid as part of our budget. So you can see that we went from 22% of our revenues coming from the state to 12%. So we lost about 10% over that time frame.
So 10% of our total revenues. It was 10%. It was 20% of our total revenue. Now it's 10%. So with $180 million budget, how much would it'd be $8 or $9 million?
So the numbers have increased. So at its peak, 21.4 million, and we broke even in 2018 again. So it took us all that time to get back to the previous funding level. And now with the Student Opportunity Act as one driver, and that really fueling higher per pupil, minimum per pupil revenue from the state. This current budget cycle, it being, I believe, $110 per student. I mean, we've never seen numbers like that over the last 5 years. 7 years.
But how does that compare to other towns?
So that's the minimum aid that any town would receive.
Again, that's my point, is we were getting much more than the minimum aid at one point. We no longer are, and I think that's what the community needs to understand, is that the reason we're pushing our budgets now, why we're asking for overrides, is we have to make up that money. There's a significant amount of funding that the state took away from us. You know, maybe we should go to our state legislatures and vote them out until they change the formula back. But, you know, there's a reason why we're asking for a lot of money. I'm not saying we shouldn't be asking for it. I'm saying we need to explain why we're asking for it. What has changed over the last 20, 30 years that we're funding more?
Kevin, can I try to jump in? I think, I hear what you're getting at, and certainly just looking at these numbers, right? Nearly 20 years of relative 20 million plus or minus some little bit, right? And clearly our budgets though have been going up like this, right? And so we have 20 million plus or minus. So as a percentage,
Right.
it's clearly taking up a much smaller percentage. And I think there's some other things that we did in here. 2006, 7, and 8 is also when all the various fees went in. And so fees today, which is not on the slides because it's not about the appropriated budget, but when we think about other sources, because the school budget, the appropriated budget that you've been showing, Kevin, doesn't include the 23 million because that's the state number. That's to run the schools is a lot more than the 90-ish million. That's just the town portion. But that $1 million of fees started 06, 07, 08. It crept up. It took time for them to get to where they're at. But for the last bunch of years, it's been about $1 million of revenue to kind of support these. So there's a bunch of different things that are happening in there. But I hear your point loud and clear that I don't know how compelling it would be to a voter that the blame the state. But I hear you that like the state being flat is one part of the narrative here, even though the expenses do go up. I mean, the state did that for a very intentional reason, and part of it was to get to a place where they thought our tax base could support a higher tax amount as compared to some other communities. So that is, I think, what they're trying to solve for.
No, that's fair, but it definitely impacts what we can spend every year.
Yeah.
And the reason why we need to ask for overrides at a certain point, because we are below what we used to be able to get. So we want to keep schools at least where we were.
Yeah, but I also think, Dennis, you can't have the conversation without thinking back all the way to when Prop 2.5 came in, right? Because street already so lean, right? And then Prop 2.5 comes in and we're stuck at this place of being lower than other communities because we weren't a community where there was this runaway growth in our taxes, right? And so we almost were a victim of our own success. So I look at it more of we've been playing catch up since the 80s and we had a bit of a reprieve from that because there was so much development in the 90s, right? So what you're saying is absolutely accurate, but I think it's only one piece of the reason why we ended up in the position that we were, that drove the 2014 override, but then also kept creating this cliff that we tried to solve for with the 2021 override so that we wouldn't continue to create a deficit for ourselves, right? So I think it's both of those things.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's the only thing. I'm saying to me, that's a big piece of it. 2.5, cut a lot of things out, and then cutting us down to the minimum state aid because we happen to be a wealthy community. Basically, is the state telling us you need to pay more you need to pay more, and that's where overrides come from. If we want to have the same quality, the state's telling us to pay more.
I also think at what point does it become irrelevant? Like, if it was so long ago, fiscal 2010. So I don't disagree with you. I agree with the conversation about sort of what led to this, but I do think residents are a little bit more focused on current budget, rate of increase, and how it's currently being funded, which is not necessarily as tied to a reduction in state aid. So it's sort of, yes, that was in the past, but we talk about, sort of how we got to the growth that we got to and why we can't manage the growth that, we continue to get. And we talk about the decisions that were made 80s, 90s, even prior to that. People are like, whatever, I wasn't there, I don't care, manage it better now.
So on the Chapter 70 piece, I hear you, but alternatively, the other argument would be, hey, you got a lot more money early on, now it's time for the other communities to catch up, so we are where we're at. if we're at, you know, $23 million, we're similarly situated. How many communities are going for overrides? It's, to me, this is the model that's been the cure, based on looking at what Arlene did, set the unique parameters for us, and doing with what we have, but also being mindful of the taxpayer, so it's trying to give certainty. Same deal as we were talking about a town meeting with debt exclusion, as debt's coming off, to put more debt on, and it's a difference of $51. So I hear you, but education is not unique to Shrewsbury either. And it's funding generally across the board. You could look at every mandate, every unfunded mandate. But right now, to me, bringing it back to the model, it's where we are, and it's addressing where our unique situation.
I'm not arguing with the model. I think the model works. What I'm saying is there's a reason we have to go to this model. It's because the larger model at the state level doesn't work for us. And maybe that's where we need to start working as a community at the state level and saying, hey, you know what, we pay taxes. So we should be getting back what we pay in taxes back to our town.
Project?
So remind me, so what parameters the state is considering when it, within the state aid? And what are the comparable communities we have that we could receive the same amount of socioeconomic demographic based on that, how they are dealing with it? One, growth wise, two, less spend, less state aid, and
I think the school comparable communities, since chapter 70 is the vast majority of our state aid, probably makes the most sense to look at. And, I mean, Joe, the number has grown to more than half the communities in the state are minimum aid at this point, I believe.
I think it's closer to 2/3 of district, yeah, of school districts. Of course, you have regionals and you have municipal districts, but yeah, I mean, and the factors that the state looks at in terms of Chapter 70 school aid is they factor in both the property value in town, equalized property value, and they look at income of the community. And they have a formula that they use, and basically they compare that to what they create as sort of a baseline budget based on your student population, where they assign different values for the types of students you have. So if you have more students who qualify as low income, there's a higher factor for state aid, because they're assuming that you need more programming to support those students, more English learners. And when they did the most recent revision, the Student Opportunity Act a few years ago, they actually increased some of those amounts to create what's called a foundation budget. Now, most school districts of socioeconomics like ours spend far above the baseline that's required in the minimum requirement. That's something that is pretty typical. The piece, though, in terms of that flattened out our Chapter 70 aid. And I did send a slide deck, and David and Kevin, I don't know if you can pull it up. I emailed the link, and I also emailed a screenshot that kind of shows the difference. It was in, I think, 2008 or so that they changed the formula. It didn't go into full effect. They put it on pause during the Great Recession. It went into full effect in FY14. But you know, it was a very dramatic difference. I mean, it takes those numbers and shows this in a bit of a visual way. But they basically said, here's your target based on your wealth. And you know, when they created that formula, it said you're getting several million more dollars now than what the formula says you need. We're not going to make you go backwards and reduce your aid year over year, but we are going to flatten it by giving you a very small percentage, a certain number of dollars per student, which typically in more recent years was in the Student Opportunity Act actually put it in the legislation that it's a minimum of $30 per year, which is a tiny percentage of our budget if we get that much per student. It's been a little better. Last year was $104. It's the best it's been in a few years. But if Kevin's able to pull this up, you'll be able to see, I mean, just as an example, while you're waiting to see it, in the growth in the early 2000s was millions of increase in Chapter 70 year over year to a peak of over $2 million more year over year in Chapter 70 funding that came to Shrewsbury over the previous year. So that's what it looks like. So Chapter 70 was, along with the new growth that the community was experiencing, was absolutely fueling the ability to keep up with the cost as the district was growing rapidly. I think looking back to some percentage increases going, it's probably back further than I have in some of the displays, but I know the year that Oak Middle School opened, for example, had to add a lot of staffing. I think the district had like a 13% year-over-year town appropriated budget increase with no override because the new growth and the Chapter 70 increases were able to provide the funding necessary to deal with that kind of staffing growth. But it purposely flattened things out and pushed to put more pressure on local dollars. And I know John and Dale McGee's analysis a few years back, Chris Girardi's from a year ago, but the slide is from, just shows the history. Patrick Collins did some of those analyses as well. That became more pressure on the local budget for sure. But they look at total property value, equalized property value, and income in the community. Those are the factors they're looking at in terms of how they determine how much you deserve, so to speak.
And Dennis, to your point, when you're talking about at the state, there are the MASC, we are starting to look at this model. And there is kind of a push now because so many are minimum aid districts to start looking at this model may be outdated.
That's the question. Are we participating or do we get any of the high income tax, the 4% over $1 million? I know that's all was intended for education. As a community, I would imagine we're participating and contributing to that. Are we getting any of that money or do we?
I think in terms of education, it's some of that money goes into the pie. I would say that we're not seeing that through Chapter 70 because we've essentially been capped, right? In terms of being able to fund, and it's not funded at the entire level it's supposed to be, but I know that in terms of funding the circuit breaker reimbursement program for high special education costs, I can't say that they earmarked, like, these are how many dollars from that pool went into education funding. I will say that there are, a lot of those dollars have gone, certainly, with all due respect to Ms. Heffernan, to public transportation and education are the two things for it. Certainly, it has fueled some of the needs in districts with greater needs.
Sure.
And under the Student Opportunity Act, communities, gateway city communities in particular, with greater socioeconomic needs, their Chapter 70 increased substantially as a result of that a few years ago, and I think that's definitely been a factor in that as well. But I couldn't tell you that anything specific dollars coming in. That's a good question, Brian.
Brian, some of the things that I've seen, certainly preschool and supporting of preschool largely in gateway cities has gotten a lot of money, as higher ed and community college, right? A lot of that being tuition free is that where that money's coming from? And MSBA getting a good chunk of extra change to build buildings, and so they've been using, I think they're trying to figure out how to use that money. How sustainable is that model? I think we have to deal with it at work. How sustainable is that model? How much revenue are we gonna get? Big questions about whether all the millionaires are gonna domicile in New Hampshire, and actually that wasn't stable, and so then they're trying to figure out what could they to do. So buildings make sense, right? We do one time and you can build some more buildings, plus the inflation market hit the buildings to such a degree, they all needed more money, so they've been doing some of those things, but they don't particularly help the bottom line here for us. Circuit breaker being a good outlier of like that, that's real money for us, and they're funding it well.
The only direct benefit we received was a few $100,000 for Chapter 90 funding under the millionaire's tax. That's the only direct funding today.
Thank you for the detail.
So, the municipal 3.5 and the education 4.25 was the maximum that was supposed to be. And there were some times we could go over it. If we didn't go over it, we kept those numbers, we'd have 2.8 million more just from the school side. Put that into the override, you add in the other ones, we're 2 years at least out on the override just from that. We're gonna get state cuts, we're gonna get unfunded mandates, we're gonna get some revenue. I don't think it's gonna stay up as high as it's been unprecedented revenue been coming in. Inflation may go up, T-bonds may go up. But in the end, it's simple. You gotta spend less money. You gotta spend less. We have stimulus funds coming in, ARPA funds, and all these things came in that we took for granted. We're not gonna have all that again. It's simple. We need to spend less. We need to have overrides at a less frequent interval. If we're good, because I'll tell you right now, just talking to people, they're not happy, and we say every 5 years we're gonna have one, and then we dump in a construction project in between, they're gonna get denied. And then we're gonna be in a bad way. We're gonna be talking about cutting, what are we gonna cut, how many people are gonna cut? So it doesn't matter what the state gives us, because we have no control of that. We don't control the interest rates, but we do control our budget. Spend less. It's that simple.
Just one quick thing though, on the stimulus funds, what we did in town, which other communities got bitten by, is the stimulus funds, super majority of it, all non-recurring expenses.
Yep.
Right, so, except in very limited circumstances, whether it was firefighters or some limited positions where it was partially funded and in the following year it was brought into the budget. I understand the reducing expenses, the pressure with that, and what this model is meant to do is provide that certainty. And what we still have is, I know in the municipal budget and school budget, if you go through that analysis, and this 3.5% doesn't get you nearly everything that you needed. If the risk we have of saying, hey, spend 0.5% less, sure, then where do you cut it from? And then and we know that that the residents of our community, their needs, their desires, their necessities of life continue to expand. So we used to have a revenue-based model that created largely an EKG chart, and that was uncertain. What the 3.5 and 4.25 is meant to do is to have a level to keep us moving with minimal investments, but to keep things moving. It's never been designed to add a lot of things. I'd be hesitant to cut back because, as has already been said, for many years, for decades, we've did that approach to cut and not meet the future needs of the community. To me, at least, this keeps us moving forward as a community and being able to address those things as they come versus taking a step back to where we were for a long period of time. And I think we're still being out.
I think, oh, sorry.
No,
Go ahead, Teresa, go ahead and Dave.
I was just going to say that, I mean, it's important to note this is kind of the current state, and we haven't gotten anywhere near to talking about what the future state would look like. So to your point, it could be 3.5, it could be 6.5, like, we're just not there yet, it won't be 6.5. But I think that you're absolutely right, but you're almost, what is the right number? If it's not every 5 years, is it supposed to be every 10 years, and is that really practical?
So I'm gonna hit, so John, what I was bringing is, yes, it was a non-reoccurring money, and we should never spend it on reoccurring expenses, and we didn't. We did a great job with that. But it was money that came into our budget that we didn't have to use. So we got to use it for books last year, other things that we could save. Our budget wasn't, that was external to our budget. All revenues that came in from all the growth we have, it won't continue that way forever. Under perfect conditions, we got all this money from the government, we got all this money from it, and we're still at a 5-year, maybe 6-year override, right? So my point is, this best case scenario, we just squeaked down an override after a 1.5 years more than we thought it was gonna be. It's going to be override fatigue. What's the right number? Well, I think it depends on what you get in every year. Now, understand there has to be, I don't want to go back to 2014, 2019. My wife and I worked on those campaigns. I don't want that. But this doesn't work either. We went above it, we spent it, and now we're in a position where, because all these new positions got put on, we have to fund it at those higher rates to keep them going. And you're right, where do we go with what the people need and what we can afford? And unfortunately, as the leaders of our finances, we have to make tough decisions. I had to lay people off. I had to have rescissions and pull budgets. I had to pull things from people. That's hard, but that's what the world is. Everyone does it in every job in their household. I can't spend and spend. Now, so what we're basically doing is taking a credit card out between each override and hoping that someone renews our credit card. Just all I'm saying is we're gonna have them, we're gonna have overrides, just move them out as further as we can.
But going back to Kevin's point earlier, and I appreciate your comments, that's a good conversation. But couldn't you take a step back and say, that's actually the mechanism by design for Prop 2.5, and it's up to the
Yeah.
community to decide whether or not to increase the base to meet the needs of the community? I actually view it that way, so I wouldn't view it as a credit card. I view it as the opportunity for the community to decide where they want to go. And what we were trying to do here is, the whole goal of the model was to provide stability, where we hadn't had stability in the time that I've been doing this. And what we had before, to Dennis's point, is we had the buffer of state aid that gave us the false sense of security. We benefited largely as a high-growth district. And the state took that formula and pushed it on everybody. And as Joe said, 2/3 of the Commonwealth of the districts are at minimum state aid. That was by design. So all of these ingredients come back to, what does the community want to have? So I view it differently, that this was the mechanism by which, back in the 50 years ago, or 45 years ago, that was put in place. And now it's the community to decide it, and that's the governance that was put in place, and that's what our community did in 07 and 08, the overrides didn't pass. In 14, the override passed, we got 7 years out of it, talked originally about 4 or 5 years. This, we talked about 4 years. And I think that the fiscal discipline, as long as we do what we say and say what we do, and what we told members of the community when we went out and exceed that, that is the question for the community going forward, that we position that to them and say, this is what we're doing, this is the model, is this what we want as a community? So I don't view it as borrowing against it, I view it exactly as what we presented to the community, together with the stabilization model, to fund it in out years. So I think it's exactly how it was designed, but Gene, go ahead,
John?
sorry.
Couple quick questions. Number one, on the stabilization, I still think we should be funding it this year, and there's room, I'm sure we can find at least $1 million. But I'm concerned about the override. We voted last night for our first one. The next one coming up will be the operational override we're sending out to the taxpayers. And then we'll have a third one beyond that. And what I get concerned about is the operational override. The people are gonna say, oh, Mick, that's it, I've had enough of this. And it's down. Then we're really in trouble on there. And it's right in the middle, starting from the DPW to the new school. And here we are, right where we're gonna really need it, okay, from the charts and everything, and it gets voted down. Now we're in big trouble. We're at ground zero, starting over again. And then you're gonna have the slashes and et cetera, so.
Just to your point, Dave, and I've been involved for a long time in all of these overrides, back to the 07, the 08, and looking at what we needed. We had a structural deficit, it was something we were trying to dig our way out of, so the vote in 14 definitely helped. But unlike the one in 21, with Kevin's guidance and looking at Arlington and setting up that stabilization fund, to me, that was the piece that we really needed to do, because when we're looking at money translates into services. So what do we want as a community for services? And that was this model that we have undertaken. What do we want as a community? What do we need to fund? What can we add? So to me, this model does work. And one thing that is a little different, and we did talk about it back in 21, Arlington has a long-term planning committee that they did set up, that they use. A couple other towns use it as well, where there is a committee, town manager, superintendent, finance committees, a member, select board, school committee, and town accountant. And they look at this fund, and they look at, like Jean was talking about, capital planning, revenue, expenditures, and it's like a quarterly assessment that goes out to the community, so everyone knows what's happening and what might be needed from year to year, and what that override dollar will get for the community who is demanding services. So I think that, as we look forward to the future, might be something that we would want to do, have a long-term planning committee that has that mechanism to provide ongoing communication, so people really understand, and where do we put our money into the services that we want, because that's what our dollars are buying. So I think, for me, this was a great model, and we worked really hard to make sure that it fit and that it would last, and I think that's exactly what it's done going forward.
Dennis, go ahead.
So you hit it, 2.5 was put in place have communities decide what they wanted to fund internally. He took it out of the select boards, town managers, et cetera. If they want to go over 2.5%, it's up to the town to say, okay, we'll go for that. And that was my point, is the state then took some more money away, and again, that's why we're in these things. So we have to the town has to decide what is important. Is school important? You know, is senior services important? Is, you know, police and fire important? And I think the override is when we bring it there, and if we vote it down, yeah, it could be a ground zero. And guess what's gonna happen? That's gonna go, they'll probably vote it in a year or two later. And maybe they'll learn from it, or maybe we'll go through that again. But I think the stabilization fund is good, but I think we need to understand that the state is saying you guys are responsible for what you want to do over 2.5%.
So, based on the information that was coming at the budget hearings and all that, I personally felt that we are already stretched as far as budgets are concerned. So if we talk about reducing, I don't know where we're gonna reduce, like just, for example, the school budget, we're top 15%, but lower 15% in terms of expenditure. I think it was 17,000 per pupil as opposed to 19,000 per pupil. So I think we are already pretty stretched. And there were a number of positions that we were talking about in other departments that we couldn't fund to get to Dave's point. So I think the model works, and we're talking about services to the community, it's important to maintain that level of service. So even though I know, yes, to Dave's point, yes, it may create a ground zero sort of situation, but we'll have to adapt. That's my feeling.
Well, I'll say this, this model is better than what we had. Like by 2021, everything was just in the toilet. But we can tweak it. Like this is not, we're gonna take this into a way out. I like the override stabilization, I like the other stabilization fund. I don't like how much we spent, the velocity of our spending, because I think, look, we see an override coming, we're just gonna spend, and we'll get it, we'll go. We can keep the spending lower to rely less on the overrides so that we have the stability. What we're all saying here is if the override doesn't pass, well, we're gonna have a lot of problems. But we'll just figure that out when it happens. I think we should plan for that and slide into it, put more money into the stabilization funds so that the override doesn't pass. We can survive for a year or two to get another override going. Instead of spending it down that we don't have anything, so when the override fails, if it does, this one or the next one, then we're just cutting.
But wasn't that the original plan of the stabilization fund, that we could project when we need to do that and go to the community in advance?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, we've already done that. Like that, the initial override was supposed to last the community 4 years, and we're looking at 6-7 years now. So we've already done that. We could have spent that money with the additional revenues coming in, but instead of spending it, we put it aside and kept it in the stabilization fund so we could draw out that 4-year commitment to a 7-year commitment, and not having to go back to the community to ask for it. So what you're saying, like we're already doing that.
I think we should do it even more.
David, the other thing though that you've talked about, and I'll turn it right over to Kevin, is that you wouldn't draw it down in the last minute and say, okay, it's
I
this.
understand,
and
but
I'll turn
you have to have a plan. What if it fails?
Well,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Kevin.
what we plan to do is ask the override question in the fall of 2026.
Right.
Within fiscal year 27. So if fiscal year 27 is balanced, 28 is balanced. And if it's approved that fall, then we would implement the following July, so July 1st of 2027 within fiscal year 2028. If it doesn't pass in the fall, there's a couple options that would be available to us. We could ask again in the spring of 2027. The reason that we're looking at the fall of 2026 is because it's a state election.
Yeah.
So we would add our override question to the state ballot as everyone is already going out. And then, again, if it wasn't successful then, we'd learn from that and we could ask a different number or take a different approach in the spring of 2027. And on the traditional local election ballot. Even if that doesn't pass, we are in the process of building the fiscal year 28 budget, which is still balanced, which will start July 1 of 2027. Obviously, the fiscal year 28 budget, if we have successive override failures, is gonna look a lot different than, you know, a 4.25%. We would begin to ratchet it back. So we have planned to do those things, right? The risky thing would be to wait until the fall of 2027 or the spring of 2028 to ask the question just a few months before fiscal year 2029 starts.
Kevin?
And the other benefit of implementing the override a year early, if you want to call it that, since fiscal year 28 is still balanced, is that it reduces the total value of the override that you need to ask of the community.
Yeah.
The sooner you ask the next override, the lower the number actually has to be.
What do we have in other stabilization funds? I mean, we do have other, that stabilization fund isn't the only fund, so if it fails, and even if it fails in 2028, there's still other money we put aside already to bring us up and above our minimums. So it's not, you know, we're not necessarily cutting the school budget every year, but we are putting money away, both to the stabilization fund, except for this year, and to the other funds out there, free cash, et cetera. So
Yeah.
I think you said the total number, including,
Our general stabilization fund is $7.9 million. We still, even after last night's vote, have almost $9 million in free cash that would be available as well. Both one-time uses, one-time revenue sources, right, shouldn't be relied upon for recurring expenses, but to your point, there are stabilizing factors.
right, if we, you know, if, you know, we have to make drastic cuts, we can do them a little less drastically for a year or two.
Any other?
Can I ask a novice question?
Please, go ahead.
As I said, novice question, and forgive me if it's kind of silly, but I know we're talking about increasing efficiency by using the word cutting and stabilization funds. What are the other options to increase revenue as a community other than, you know, having everybody buy local and drive businesses? I mean, what are the other options that might exist, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, real property tax growth is the number one, but, you know, you could really double impacts of things, you know, if we could get a major hotel here, right, that would bring hotel motel tax and tax revenue to the community. There's some other options that are coming in there's a bill called the Municipal Empowerment Act that has local options where we could increase some of the percentages on local receipts. So, you know, motor vehicle excise tax and meals excise tax. Motor vehicle obviously is impacting residents. Meals impacts residents and non-residents, so, but the number one thing is sustaining economic growth within the community, and it's easier when it's commercial growth than it is residential.
And my question was intended to not increase any burden on the residents, but more just as a way to drive to the community, so.
So with,
Let's move, Josh.
Uh,
Oh, sorry, Michelle. Yeah.
So with the new growth that we are seeing significantly, which is, as you mentioned, unexpected or more than expected, right? So when we are going to realize that revenue or associated to the new growth, and how would that will impact in the long run?
So we have been experiencing it on an annual basis. So our new growth revenue has been around, you know, $1.5 million every year. And that, again, equates to like $120 million in growth. And there's a number of projects still in the pipeline that are at the planning board and have yet to be constructed that were approved by the planning board. And we don't get that new growth until it's, you know, actually constructed and available and able to be assessed. So we're optimistic that, you know, UPS has broken ground. That's, you know, that's about a $50 million. If as long as there's like one major residential or commercial project that's, you know, that's hitting in an annual cycle, we'll continue to see that above normal new growth. And I would say normal general background new growth within the community, things that are captured that aren't major capital or commercial investments, is somewhere around $900,000. So it's really that $500,000 bump. It's not all or nothing, right? It's not 1.5 or 0. there is a static line, a trend line that we can look at.
Michelle?
So, Kevin, can you explain with commercial property, commercial development, the reason why it's so valuable to see, like, especially high, like, high value commercial development, like biotech and, those more advanced things? It's not just the property tax that they're paying, but it's also the personal property
Right.
tax.
Right.
So it's not just the building and the land, it's what's inside the building
Yeah.
as well. So those like high value commercial growth is really valuable to the community.
So I'll use an extreme example, right? I don't know if everyone has been down the pike and has seen the new Amazon warehouse that sits in the town of Charlton. It's granted, westbound, it's on the left. It's a massive facility. It's about it's a 2 million square foot building. The shell of that building, it's my understanding, cost about $50 million to construct, and it's valued about that. The property inside of that is about $250 million worth of, so, 4 times the size or roughly that, 3 times the value of what's on the outside. So only commercial property has a industrial or commercial industrial personal property tax on it. So individual private residents obviously don't have that tax. So that is a double benefit.
So, follow up on that Michelle's question. So both Bushy and Repligen both have personnel in there, or what is it?
They, Repligen has more personnel. They're still fitting out the space, so they're still growing. Where we'll see a big personal property impact in the new growth of some in the current year and then some into fiscal year 27 is from Physique Instrumente. That's going to be the big bump in the next cycle, and then 27 into 28 would be UPS, or we would see substantial.
Thank you.
Anything else? Any other comments, questions? Lindsay?
Yeah, one of the things, and certainly we heard it last night, and I hear it in your comments, Gina, sort of the tension between the operating and the capital, and that those of us who've been doing this know you build a building, you have to hire the teachers to go in it, right? Or potential, and I know you got a question last night about would there be any potential staffing expansions, right, at DPW, and so these two things have to be thought together, although they don't always rise or fall together. And have we looked at some other communities? I know there is a provision in state law to do just a capital stabilization. Is that something that we've explored? Would that make some sense to bear some? Look, you're never going to stock up enough money to build the high school expansion. I'm not suggesting that, but to bear some of that cost, or to make capital costs maybe not have to hit free cash or some other things. I understand why you did it. Is that something you've thought about? It's just another way when we think about ways we can sort of save and put some pennies away for the future? And I don't know what the maybe historical thinking has been. That's really to you, Kevin, but to others who've been in their roles maybe longer than I have.
I mean, I think it's a good conversation to have. There's some positives and negatives from my perspective.
Okay.
One of them is it requires a 2/3 vote to pull it out. So not the hardest thing to do in the world. Certainly it was approved last night. But, and the other thing that I think about is somewhat of a catch-22 since we don't have a lot of extra money. Like, how do we fund our current capital needs while building a stabilization balance? We did start one, or are proposing one, a small one this year for fire equipment, since a fire engine is over $1 million. So we would start to set aside about $250,000 a year to prepare for that. An opportunity that we could have if the Municipal Vulnerability Act were to pass, we could dedicate a new revenue source. Let's say we're willing to increase meals tax another 1/4%. You could say that 1/4% equivalent automatically goes into a capital stabilization account. So it's kind of like adding another direct deposit to your paycheck. Like you don't ever get to touch it. So it is an option through law that it becomes an automatic deposit in. You don't even need to vote at a town meeting. Coming out, it still needs a 2/3.
Okay.
Questions or comments? Well, I guess I'm not seeing any. It's been a great conversation. Appreciate it.
I actually have one.
Go ahead.
for next year, as the budgeting goes in, I think it'd be good to get the finance committee, even if we're a non-participant, just listening to hear what's going on, because one thing that many of us feel like is we're asked to vote, do we approve of this or not? You know, it's too late. If we don't approve it, we're going to cancel the budget. It's, you know, there's a lot of pressure that you almost have to approve it. It'd be easier so we can make comments if we, you know, if we saw something and said, hey, we really think we should be doing something like this, or we think we wouldn't want to really approve that type of cost. Easier to do it earlier in the year, even though we don't have the budgets full, but then at the end.
I think one thing we could do is just when the select board has a meeting and talks about the budgeting process and first glance or fiscal priorities, that to share that information. I know a lot of this is pushed out, but that can help inform at least the process to where it comes to the budget and fiscal projection one. Doesn't just happen magically. There are conversations that go there, and invite the finance committee to those select board meetings. That's an opportunity for it.
Right, or just flag them, right?
Yeah.
So be like, okay, this is a select board meeting that you might like to either attend or watch after, because this is what's gonna be talked about.
Yeah, the Taylor and the
Right.
bookmark, and you can point that out to help before you have the meeting. Okay.
So as we talk about as we go forward, you know, we talk about how the budgets are going to increase, percentage of the budgets are going to increase. One thing we also have to think about is how do we give back to the community? I mean, we just passed something that is going to raise everyone's utility rates, we use free cash, it's going to cost everyone $177 on average. Can we maybe in our budget slow it down a little bit? Maybe not raise I talked about not raising the pay-as-you-throw back, small thing. Maybe have the dog license go back to $10. Little things that people see. Not bring on a position, drop some of the fees down. You know, if we do that and we show people, hey, we're trying to reduce out of the same checkbook, trying to reduce things, small things, I think they're gonna have a better feeling. I'm talking to a lot of people who feel like we just in a cycle of consumption, that we're taking every time from it, we don't give anything back. There's services being given back. When they're writing the checks, that's not what they're thinking. They don't think about my garbage being picked up and this and that. So maybe in this cycle, if we can do just a few things and then not only just do it, because I know like when we used to pay 60% of the pay-as-you-throw bags, it wasn't really advertised. You cut it back to 15 people. So I'm like, oh, my bag's raised. Get it out there and say, you know, this is what the budget was. We cut it back to this because we want to give this back and that back. And I think that's going to help us for any of these other projects we go forward. Because right now, everyone's just talking about, we're just eating their money, we're not giving anything back. And that was just an observation.
Sure.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mr. Remington. At the same time, I would not be so categorical about that's what everybody's thinking. I have a lot of folks who talk to me about that they are deeply appreciative of the value they get from this community, the municipal services they get. We were with police and fire today. Mr. Girardi organized a training around active shooter training, incredibly sobering training. One of the only police departments in the state that has all of our officers trained in the state-of-the-art response to active shooters. And our fire department's been trained as well. The value of, and I'm going to write about this in my next superintendent's update. I just, in the last 2 weeks, my new podiatrist is my former student at Oak Middle School. The person who filled my prescription is a former student. The person who was in line is a former student who's now a cancer researcher at UMass. I read an article in the Boston Globe written by my former Floral Street student, ran into his parents at Price Chopper, who couldn't be more proud. And to say that people just think we're consuming and we're not adding value, I just think is absolutely not true. I had a parent email me today who looked at the message the school committee sent out yesterday and said, I don't want to be proud that we're spending in the bottom 15% of the state. By the way, before the override, we're in the bottom 5%. A community that looks like this, where we have a range of socioeconomics, for sure, and there are people who are struggling, no doubt. But we are overall an affluent community. To be spending less than 95% of the districts in the state, that's not a place I want to go back to. So to suggest that, and frankly, you know, a lot of these pieces would ring or resonate more if we were taxing above the average, if we were spending above the average. Those are far away from where we are. So personally, and I've been here a long time now, I don't want to go back to the days where we get the EKG budgets and some of the things that we've cut have never come back.
Yeah.
So yes, is it simple to cut costs? 100% it's simple to cut costs, no doubt. Is it simple to cut costs and not damage the quality of what we're trying to do and what this community says they want of us? And I think there's a whole lot of folks in this community, and I think frankly, the way that override passed, when people said, you're gonna pass an override during COVID, are you crazy? What was it, 60-40? People value what they get in this community. So I would respectfully disagree that everyone thinks we're just consuming and the velocity of our spending. All the statistics say we are incredibly high value for a really, it's an incredibly high value community, municipal, the services we get, what we provide educationally. I look forward to making sure we maintain that value and make the right investments so we can continue it. So that's my 2 cents on that.
I just wanted to tag on to that a little bit, and Dr. Swarkas tapped onto what I wanted to talk about, but I think it's really important as the school and the town that we're having these conversations with the community, because it's really easy for me to talk to my group of people and they're going to tell me what is important to them. It's really, Beth can talk to another group of people and they say, well, schools are important, but this is really important to me. And I think that we really need to, as a town as a whole, need to do a better job of engaging the community. And how we do that, I'm not completely sure, but I think that we need to listen to see what they want to invest in, and that means capital projects. Not that I want to pit projects against each other, but I think that we need to be as transparent as possible and put everything out on the table so that we can have an honest conversation, that we can have people come and say, I don't want to raise my taxes, but I also want to make sure I have a senior center. I want to make sure I have a library. I want to make sure I have a DPW. I want to make sure that there's not overcrowding at the schools. I think that this is something that we need to think about as a group, as involving us. We have, 19 of us that are making really big decisions for the town. But I think that we need to do a better job of involving everybody else and giving that education, so that when the town comes out to town meeting, it's not a fight against what we want to fund. It's we want to push Shrewsbury to be a better community. That's just something I want to talk about.
If I could add on to Rachel's point, one thing I like about this model is the predictability. It helps. We're not a not-profit oriented town. Our budgets are basically not for profit. We have to provide services, and this long-term planning, say for the schools or for the municipal departments, they can plan 10 years ahead if they know that they have a 4.25 or whatever committed for the next X amount of years. So that's another positive I see in this model, that as opposed to the EKG. That's a comment I wanted to make.
Dennis, go ahead.
I also think we have been giving back to the community in different ways. I know when I first started here, there were no bus fees. There were all these other things that weren't there. Bus fees went pretty high up when my kids were there, and I know we've cut bus fees back. It's not at zero. We've cut sports fees back, which is a lot of kids or grandkids, that can now play sports. So we have been giving some stuff back. The question is, how much you can give back that actually means something and doesn't hurt the rest of the budget.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate this, and I think it just bears repeating the stability and what it means for education. And I can only speak to that side because I don't have to plan for the police department and the long-term training and the other things that I heard Chief Anderson's suggestion about how long it takes to have an officer be trained and actually ready to go. Right, these things take time. But a very similar way, education and that stability, that levelness, while it maybe causes some agita of couldn't it be lower, that levelness to us is a way to say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to finally do a really serious investment in literacy, and we needed it desperately, right? And that meant that we needed to have some more literacy coaches, and that meant we need some curriculum, and that meant those people didn't go away. And then it meant us looking and going, actually, we have 7th and 8th graders who need that because they were in COVID in 3rd grade when they should have been, really anchoring, and now we're going to do that. And so, but we could not have done that if we were at the same time going like, what are we going to cut this year to keep something going, right? And so should we cut foreign language in 7th grade and starting in 8th grade? Those years, and I only had to do one of them as a school committee member, and it was not pleasant. I think there's that. And then on the flip side, I do think we all need to kind of be really transparent about the limitations that we have on to just figure out how to cut, right? And so to just cut, and I don't even mean like, could class sizes go up? Of course they could. That is a choice we can make as a community to say, let's raise class sizes. But the regulatory environment in the school environment has changed dramatically in the last 20 odd years, right? And what we are expected to provide costs money, and it mostly costs staff. And it costs specialized staff to do that, whether it's in special ed or 504 plans or homeless students. And so we have that on the one hand, that those things essentially can't get cut. So just like the federal government looks at what's discretionary, those things in many ways are not discretionary, or we could try to cut them and we're gonna get sued and gonna have to go put them all back, right? That's a balance. On the flip side, the things that are discretionary are generally the things that people want us to do as a community, right? They want more APs and they want smaller class sizes and they want more foreign language and they think we should put health back at the elementary level. And so those things are what make us better, right? We've added some career exploration and trying to put more of that in because yes, vocational has been challenging. And so the things that we hear, and I do think it's who you hear from, that's a definite piece here, of like, they want us to do our job as required for everybody, and that is at a level that's important and costs money, and do all of the other stuff, right? And so, yes, I suppose we could cut and sort of figure out how to make that number lower, but the quality is going to be different. And is that, and I think that's the question of like, is that what the community really wants? Or how do we keep talking about this so they understand why it is that you need to sort of support municipal and some level budgetary certainty gets you a lot of the things that do take time to build up. Because it's easy to cut 1 year. We don't go back in 1 year, not even close, right? Not even close. And so, because new problems crop up too that need to be dealt with.
All in all, I think I really like the 3 tri-board meeting. So this is very good. I think I mentioned in the beginning. Maybe it's last 7 years back or 8 years back we did this. I think I would like to at least recommend that we do have this at a regular basis so that we can all discuss things in open and honest conversations and transparent way. And then so that communities involved, they watch and learn why we have 4.25, where this came from, if I'm not part of it few years back, right? So this is really good. I think it gave me some good insights into that. I think hopefully everyone have a good value out of it, and definitely community will have a greater advantage being refreshed at a regular basis.
Beth and then Dave.
I just wanted to note what's been done as far as tax relief programs for the community. You know, with the 2021 override, one of the things that the select board at the time was really feeling that there were people who this was really going to be a heavy lift to try to afford the increase, right? And we recognized that the police station was also hitting at the same time. And so we did make sure at that time that we were maxed out in all the ways possible to provide exemptions for those people who qualify, and then also created the Stand with Shrewsbury tax relief fund that does, I believe, did it come out 12,000? How much? I thought it was $12,000 a year in tax relief to individuals who do qualify for that. And I know not everyone feels comfortable visiting the assessor's office to say that maybe they need help, but that process is available, and it is a discrete process, and their privacy is respected. But we make sure we check back on that frequently. You know, the HERO Act just came out, and we made sure that all of the different tax exemptions that were part of the HERO Act were also things that we were implementing in town. So every opportunity to make sure that people who qualify for that kind of relief are able to access it has been taken care of and addressed.
Dave.
So,
Go ahead, Dave.
just to clarify, Dr. Sawyer, I have never said anything about the quality of school or your leadership or the people in school. I think it's fantastic. I've told you that to your face a few times. I think it's fantastic. So I'm not talking about the teachers. I know if we gave you more money, you'd do more good things. If we gave the town more money, we'd do more good things. And I think Canada's done a good job at sailing the ship, especially through COVID. But I do think the velocity at which we're spending is, I'm not comfortable with. I would like to see more money to the stabilization funds, because I'm not confident that the overrides are a consistent thing we can rely on. And I am very concerned, I've said this many times, that if that override doesn't pass, we're going to be in big trouble. We're going to be talking about what we did in we're 20, about 30, 40 people in schools, cutting police, already down 17, gonna cut them, all the cuts are gonna happen. So I just think we have to look at that, maybe a possibility, we know that, so I've never, if you took it that way, I'm sorry, I've never meant to insult you or your staff, but I do think the velocity of all the budget needs to decrease.
I appreciate that, Mr. Remington. I'm not suggesting you were criticizing the quality of what we do. What I'm suggesting is, it's not as simple to say we can scale back some percent without doing damage to the quality of what we do provide. If it was simple enough to just cut back on expenses and we could have the same quality, of course we'd cut back on expenses, why wouldn't we? But there are hard choices to make, and there are levels of investment that need to be sustained, to have stability, to make plans, to respond to needs. Whether those are more English learners who are moved into our community, whether that's the mental health crisis that started before COVID and was exacerbated by COVID. A lot of the people we added when we had a 4.75% budget, I think the second year after the override, were mental health support staff. And thank God we did. Because I tell you what, I mean, we could use more. We're doing the best we can with what we have. So I appreciate that and I respect it. But there are choices to be made when you scale back on what you invest in. We do, I think, a very good job of making sure that what we provide is not fluff. It's not just extra stuff. It's core needs that our students have to get the education that people expect of them. So that's the point I was trying to make, and I didn't mean to insinuate otherwise. So, but thank you.
If I just may, just in favor of Dave's point, I think we should all be cognizant of the risks that he is raising. It is definitely a risk that we all have to be aware of and acknowledge in our planning going forward.
And that's part of the timing going a couple of years before that, right? It's not immediate, you're not doing it so you have a $10 million cliff the following year. Adjustments would have to be made. There'd be hard choices, and they'd be drastic, but it wouldn't be a huge cliff. There is a timing mechanism built in this for those opportunities, but at the same time, if the community says, that's enough, then choices will be made at that point, but there's still a budget cycle to make those as smart as possible without absolutely devastating everything for a decade to come. So appreciate it, and absolutely. Gene, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to make a comment after Dr. Sawyer's remarks. I talk to a lot of people in this community quite often also. And I look at around this table and I don't think there's anybody that's hurting in any way financially, family-wise, etc. But I just hope making these decisions going forward, we keep in mind the people that are struggling and also the seniors in our community, that we keep those in our decisions as we move forward on it. So that's just a comment.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Teresa, please.
Thanks. I'm aligned with you in terms of we have to be careful about the year-over-year rate of increase, but I also think that in our positions, we have to be very careful about signaling that the velocity of spend is excessive. I think we need to qualify statements like that, just to make sure that we are not telling people that it's excessive spending. So I agree with the group that I think there have been a lot of trade-offs, that these numbers could be a lot higher than they are, and I think it is balanced with how long can we stretch this. I mean, we all sit through the department hearings, and we hear department by department about what their needs are and what we have to say no to, and there are some, very critical things. So I think that as our budget increases, we're all very mindful of, 5% on $180 million is much different than, 5% on 200 plus million. So I agree with you there. I just want to make sure that I think it's great feedback that people need to have better exposure. It is the challenge I think we all have of what are we doing? How are we saving? How are we mitigating expenses to every extent possible while still continuing to deliver the services that people need and expect, and recognizing that we have to pay people to work in town that directly deliver these services. And I think that's going to be, you know, quite an ongoing challenge as well.
Gene, to your point, if you look at our 2030 strategic plan, and I'm not going to get the words exactly right, but the plan, the baseline is where all can thrive. And that is what should form every budget decision that our community does going forward until 2030, and then is the next strategic plan after that. But that's the goal, and that's part of all of our decisions. We know that there are many residents in our town that are struggling, and we need to be mindful of all of them in our decisions. So that's important, and that's why this part of the budget process, past several years now, since we've adopted the strategic plan, we are mindful of that, but need to make sure going forward we are as well. So appreciate all the comments. Any other final comments? Thank you all. This has been great. Appreciate the conversation. Really good feedback from everybody. The tone of the conversation was great. I think the one other thing too, and I won't be in this role, but you guys continue to meet, but also encourage every one of these boards to meet individually too. I think COVID changed a lot of things, just to get to know each other and encourage an opportunity maybe to meet with members of town meeting. They're also important as part of this process. We have 240 members who make decisions that impact all of our community, then a chance to meet them as well. So I thank all of you for coming this evening. I know there are a lot of meetings this week and coming forward through middle May, and thank you for your time, and have a great night. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah,
Thank you.